Well, thank you for inviting me to speak to you today. It's embarrassing for somebody from Los Angeles to recommend to anybody else how to deal with traffic or congestion or anything like that, because we have the worst in the country. But I thought the context might be right in another place called LA. And I'll try to make more connections between Scott Doyon's wonderful talk and what I'll have to say today. Many of you may remember from your college days that professors come in two types. I don't mean the liberals and the conservatives or the men and the women. I mean the cats and the dogs. The dogs like to run around in packs, and each one wants to be top dog, and they follow the leader. But the cats are solitary, and they like to mark territory as their own so that other cats will stay out. Well, in transportation planning, all the dogs chase after moving cars, or they like to ride around in them excited by speed with their heads hanging out the windows. But the cats don't like riding around in the cars, and they mark the tires to keep the territory as their own. Well, cars are parked 95% of the time, as yours are now. So I thought that, well, the dogs were chasing after cars during the 5% of the time that they're moving. I thought I could find out something about the 95% of the time that cars are parked. It's very important. Some of you were probably even conceived in a parked car. Well, I was excited to be called a parking rock star, but I know that's not the same as a real rock star, although I have been thinking of changing my name to Shoup Dog. And I was certainly honored to be called a Yoda of urban planning until I remembered from Star Wars that Yoda was 800 years old. I think, here's a view of California that I think many people represents all of California, and it represents too much of it. It's the campus, as they call it, the Cisco systems. And all these cars that you see there are parked free. This is a workday afternoon with a lot of empty parking spaces as well. But just because the driver doesn't pay for parking doesn't mean the cost goes away. The cost is still there, and somebody has to pay for it. And that somebody is everybody. You pay for parking as a customer, as a store, or as a taxpayer, or as a homeowner, or anything that you buy. A little bit of the money gets siphoned off to pay for parking, even if you didn't drive, and even if you're too poor to own a car. Some of every transaction gets taxed in order to pay for that free parking. And cities didn't just happen this way. They're planned this way. In fact, the cities won't allow it to happen in any other way. Here's a graph illustrating the parking requirements in San Jose. The green represents 1,000 square feet of any building, and the red shows the size of the required parking lot. And almost always, the parking lot is bigger than the building itself. And yet, if you ask any planner, how did you come to those parking requirements, they couldn't tell you. They copied it from some other city in general. I'm staying in Portland when I was here, and I looked at it from the air, as I always do, to see, well, maybe there are probably parts of Portland that look a little bit like Los Angeles, and there are parts that have a lot of parking. And it's partly because of Portland's parking requirements. Again, the green shows 1,000 square feet of a building, and the red shows the required parking lot. And it's always more parking required than the building itself. I also spoke in Freeport. I had heard of that. When I looked out from the air, I thought maybe they were going to change the name of the city to free parking. And again, it's because of their parking requirements. They require so much land for parking compared to a building that a lot of buildings don't happen. You can't see what doesn't happen, but a lot of things do not happen because of parking requirements. You can't open a restaurant or a nail salon, or whatever you want to open, or a B&B, because you don't meet the parking requirement. And where do these parking requirements come from? A lot of them come from a publication by the American Planning Association called Parking Standards. Standards sound like a good idea. High standards are something we should all aim for, don't you think? But this, except that you get this vision of the cover shows the kind of city that we're creating. But the parking requirements are not parking standards, and this book doesn't talk about any standards at all. It simply shows a survey of parking requirements in a select number of cities throughout the country. And there's something like 7 pages of this for 600 different land uses. If you're an urban planner, and the Planning Commission said, well, how many parking spaces should we have for an animal kennel? You can't say, I don't know, or that we shouldn't have one, or you'd be fired. You have to find out how to do it some way. You have no training in how to set a parking requirement. So you look into a book like this and find out what the nearest comparable city requires, and then you select that. Here's just the first page. There are 9 different kinds of adult land uses, and we don't have to explain what an adult land use means, but there are adult massage parlors, and adult bookstores, adult movie theaters, and adult novelty shops and things like that. And if that's the kind of picture the American Planning Association thinks that America should look like, we're in tough shape. But it is the kind of land use that gets produced by these parking requirements. So when you look at the parking requirements by themselves, each one might seem reasonable. Say for a barber shop, there's a parking space for the barber, and a parking space for the barber in the chair, and there's often a gender discrimination. I don't understand quite why. But there's almost always at least one parking space per person, except for religious uses, and even then there's a gender discrimination. But when you get away from one parking space per person, it's one parking space per what? So usually it's per 1,000 square feet, as though you would measure this and you would know how much is needed. But for some purposes, for many purposes, it does, per 1,000 square feet doesn't really make sense. So for a gas station, it really doesn't depend on the size of the gas station. And for a swimming pool, you have to have parking space requirements for swimming pools, or else there might not be enough parking. And even parking requirements for the afterlife. Well, the problem with this is that urban planners, and I'm sure there's some of you here today, know that you got no training in parking requirements whatever in graduate school. There was never any instruction, partly because the professors had nothing to teach you. The only thing you learn about them is that they get in the way of anything you want to do, like build affordable housing or have transit-oriented development or something like that. You know the parking requirements make it impossible to do what you would like to see. So the planners have several ways in which their hands are tied behind their back. They don't know how much the parking spaces cost. And how can you tell how many parking spaces people need if you just don't know how much they cost? Or how they affect the cost of housing and everything else. If you have to have, in some parts of LA, 3 parking spaces per dwelling unit, well, how much does that increase the cost of a dwelling unit and really reduce the number of dwelling units? Or how it affects the looks of a city. As we drove here today, there's so many land uses with all the parking in front of the building, showing that pedestrians are really not the real customers for these places, the drivers of the people they're looking for. Or really how much more parking spaces will increase the number of cars and increase traffic congestion, and therefore air pollution. And now we have to worry about CO2 emissions. Won't more parking spaces lead to more cars, lead to more CO2 emissions? And we're trying to prevent that. And they have no training, whatever. So I think the problem is that cities are politicizing which should be a business decision. The businesses who pay for the parking should be the ones who decide how much to provide. And I think it's foolish to think that they won't provide any if the city doesn't require it, that the only reason they provide any parking at all is because the city requires it. They'll provide as much as they think it's worthwhile for their customers. And we've governmentalized something that should have remained a private decision, because the people in the government really have no clue as to how the parking requirements affect everything else in the city. Getting back to the cost of parking requirements, I did a short bit of research on how much parking spaces cost, and for most of the major cities, their cost estimators show the cost per square foot of different kinds of construction, and one of them is for parking garages. So I looked at the cost of a parking space, which is about 330 square feet, including the aisles. And I think for an above-ground garage, it's about $24,000, and for an underground garage, it's averaged about $34,000. So how can you say how many parking spaces we'll need when you really, I haven't thought they cost $24,000 or $34,000. They're free, aren't they? They can't cost that much, but they're very expensive. And do we have the capacity to pay for this? The Census Bureau is now provides estimates on the net wealth of families, so all your assets minus all your liabilities. So if you died today, what would your estate be worth? And it's not as high as many of us would think. Say for the nation as a whole, it's about $67,000 in net assets per family. But for minority communities, it's much lower. So the median net wealth, half above and half below, for Hispanics is about $7,000, over $7,000. For blacks, it's only $6,000. So one parking space can cost more than 3 times the net wealth of more than half of all minority families. And yet cities are saying, oh, well, they need parking spaces for work and at school and the Dairy Queen, every place they go. We have to require parking spaces so these people can park free when they get there. And many households have negative net worth. They owe more than they have assets, especially young people. They have significant college debts. And the only way they can take advantage of the parking spaces that cities require is to buy a car, which they often have to pay for with these subprime auto loans at enormous interest rates. So I don't think we're as rich as many of us thought. So I want to boil down an 800-page book into just 3 bullet points. That's all I have to say. It charges the right price for curb parking. And who could disagree with that? I mean, it's a tautology. But what I mean by the right price is the lowest price you can charge, so there's always 1 or 2 open spaces on every block. So wherever you go, you'll see 1 or 2 open spaces. You have great parking karma. Just what you want. This is what the driver wants to see, is 1 or 2 open spaces. And then to show that this has a relevant benefit, as Scott Dorion talked about in his wonderful talk, is that you spend all the meter revenue to pay for added public services on the street, to clean the sidewalks, to repair the sidewalks, some cities provide free Wi-Fi for everybody who lives on the street or has business on the street. And when I was in Portland, somebody said, oh, we could use that to hang flower baskets from every pole in the city, sort of make it look like an English seaside town. Something that if you have parking meters, you get this benefit, and if you don't have parking meters, you don't get this benefit. So I think that's what Scott was talking about, saying that there is a relevant benefit from this policy. And to make the unreasonable people seem unreasonable, you say, well, would you rather have free parking and no spaces available and no free Wi-Fi and broken sidewalks and no flowers hanging from the pole? Would you prefer that to the idea of a parking benefit district where you charge the right price for curb parking and spend the revenue in the metered area? And I think that would, that revenue return will convince people to want to charge for parking. As Scott was saying, don't throw meat to the wolves, the drivers who don't want to pay for parking. You give benefits to the people who are stakeholders on the block, the property owners, the merchants, and the residents. So that you have to create not the desire to pay for parking. Nobody wants to pay for parking, including me. But you can create the desire to charge for parking because I want the money. Just the way a parking lot owner charges for parking. Not because they think it's a good public policy or will slow global warming. It's because they want the money. There's nothing wrong with wanting money. And then once you do that, you could reduce the off-street parking requirements because nobody can say that there's a building, a restaurant opens up without any off-street parking, that'll jam the curbs because the price will adjust so that there'll always be one or two vacant spaces. And then you could also, in the older cities like this, it will make it much easier to reuse older buildings for higher uses, to preserve older buildings. I'll get back to that in a while. So these prices are very simple. You aim for about 85% occupancy rate. And for a small town, it's very easy to do. You don't need a lot of technology. You just have to look at the streets. And I could walk around Portland and I could just look at any street and say the price is too low or too high. It's that simple. And then if you see one or two open curb spaces, you know the price is right. And I think that's a lot better than having free parking and no place to park. I think San Francisco was the first city that went into this in a big way. First thing to do is to hire, Scott didn't mention it, but I would say hire a graphic designer to show what we're trying to do. And the top block is what you don't want to see, that there's no place to park. And the bottom block has ample open spaces, so it's underused. The prices on both blocks are awful. So if you just nudge up the price on the top block and nudge it down on the bottom block, you could get this. Now some people say, oh, well that's not America, that's too big a social change, a wrenching social change. We can't have, our citizens can't handle that. It'd be like Prohibition or the Reformation. But if we can't nudge a car from one block to the other, what can we do? If we can't do that, isn't that just giving up? And why trust the government to do anything if they can't do something as simple as that? It's the Goldilocks principle. Not too high, not too low, but just right. And anybody can walk along any street and you're suddenly a parking expert, a parking pricing expert, because you can say whether it's too low or too high. In research we did in Westwood Village, a little 15-block shopping center next to UCLA, on average it turned out that all the spaces were full and there were 2 cars circling every block. And if you nudged the price up on those blocks, you could get 1 open space on every block, which is what everybody wants to see. They also hired a graphic designer to do a wonderful short movie. It only lasts 2 minutes, but if you had to choose between listening to me or watching this movie, I would recommend the movie.
Finding a parking space can be frustrating and time-consuming. It's estimated close to 1/3 of city traffic is caused by drivers circling while looking for a space. Some drivers just give up and double park. This clogs our streets and needlessly pollutes the air. These cars slow down public transit and get in the way of emergency vehicles. And drivers focused on finding parking create a hazard for pedestrians and cyclists. There is a better way. San Francisco is testing new parking technology and a flexible approach to pricing that is designed to make parking work better for everyone. SF Park's goal is to have at least 1 parking space available per block. That way, drivers can park near a specific destination without the need to circle the block or double park. This also provides a steadier flow of customers for business owners. SF Park provides safer and clearer streets for everyone. Here's how it works. Newly installed parking sensors detect when a parking space is available. Drivers will be able to check parking availability and rates online, by text message, and by smartphone before heading to their destination. This will help people decide whether to drive, take public transit, bike, or walk. When people choose to drive, new SF Park meters will make paying easier. In addition to taking coins, the new meters will accept credit cards and SFMTA parking cards. Parking time limits will be extended. Easier payment and extended time limits will help drivers avoid tickets. Prices at city-owned parking garages will be adjusted to provide an attractive alternative to meter parking. Parking rates will be adjusted based on demand, once a month, never by more than 50 cents. So, in areas where it seems nearly impossible to find a parking space, rates will increase until at least one space is available most of the time. And in areas where open parking spaces are plentiful, rates will decrease until most of the empty spaces fill, or until rates bottom out at as little as 25 cents per hour. SF Park is designed to ensure that drivers easily find an open space near their destination.
Well, I suggest that for those of you from Portland, whenever you walk along the street and see all the spaces occupied, you want to tell somebody here that the price is too low, or if there are a lot of spaces open, you want to report the price is too high. And I think the interesting thing about San Francisco is everybody thought it set prices through the roof, but the average price actually declined. They charge different prices at different times of the day. When you have the same price all day long, it's going to be too high at some times and too low at others. It was way too high in the morning. The prices could go up to $6 an hour, but many more went down to, I think something like 17 blocks went up to $6 an hour, but something like, what was it, 179 went down to 25 cents an hour in the morning. So that's why the price went down. And I think the price should be zero if the spaces are still available at that price. So it leads to higher prices only if the demand is higher at the time that the demand is higher, in the location that the demand is higher. And there's some very good results. They had a pilot area where they had 7,000 meters that they adjusted the prices. The different prices on different blocks, from one block to another, and at different times of day. They only change the prices once every 2 months, so they're not jumping up and down from one day to the next. There's different prices at different times, but they stay that way for 3 months. There's a reduction in vehicle miles traveled. The fewer cars driving around hunting for a parking space. And the number of parking tickets declined because you don't have to park at a bus stop or by a fire hydrant if you're desperate to park for a few minutes. And the tax revenue went up in the metered area. You can't say that the variable prices at meters hurt business because in the areas with the variable prices and parking availability, the sales tax went up. That means the businesses are making more profits, they're hiring more employees, the restaurants are serving more customers. The business is doing better if the sales tax went up. And some people think you can't do this because they don't know what meters can do. Most people think that meters are like this original one from 1935. And most meters in most cities, including in Portland and Lewiston, operate the same way. You put your money in and you hope to come back before your time runs out so you don't get a ticket. So they were thought of as the infernal combination of a slot machine and an alarm clock. But what other industry has not changed in 80 years? What industry would be alive if they hadn't changed in 80 years? But when it comes to parking in American cities, most of them have not changed at all. But the new meters can do all kinds of things. There's a meter on the UCLA campus, a multi-space meter. It doesn't even tell the price until you press a button, and then it tells you what the price is at that time, before different price schedules during the day. It seems expensive to charge students, doesn't it? $3 for the first hour, $4 for the second hour. And so you can see my reflection in there with my camera. So I think some of you probably suspect that professors have a lot of spare time on their hands. And to some extent that's true. I set up my camera across from 8 parking spaces, governed by that one multi-space meter. 8 parking spaces, the average number of spaces on a block, parallel, not diagonal, the way this one is. And I took a picture every 4 minutes to see how this parking performed. Is this the right price? So you can see the shadows move as I took pictures. The 2 cars at the end never moved because you can park for 2 hours if you want to. But here's 4 minutes later. Let me see. 4 minutes later, you see 1 car left and 1 car arrived. And you usually see somebody paying at the meter. Another 4 minutes, another car left, another car arrived. Usually there's one space. One time there was no spaces, but then quickly a vacancy arrived. One vacancy is what you want. Very productive. It's like inventory in a store. Who would ever go to a store that all the shelves are bare? And if you're trying to park and all the spaces are full, you say they have no inventory. And sometimes there were 2 spaces available. Once I think there was 3 spaces available. But it sort of works, I think, the way it should. The people are coming and going. They're all paying. And whenever I'm doing this, I usually, and you can do it when you go in your city, is this the way co-parking works in your city? If you set up a camera across from any block in Portland or Lewiston and took a picture for an hour, is this what you would see? I doubt it. So here's just a bar chart. We have to do that to show you've done some research. And mainly it is one open parking space. For the right price, I don't think it should be higher. If it were higher, there'd be too many vacancies and the spaces wouldn't be used. Students couldn't go to the law school library there. And it shouldn't be lower because if it were lower, there wouldn't be any open spaces. And people would drive around and curse the lack of parking. It's just the Goldilocks principle. It's also like the Supreme Court's definition of pornography. Is I know it's what I see. You can't predict the right price of parking. You can just look at it and see, is it right? And then you use that experience, and for the next month or 2, you set that as the price and see what happens. It's that easy. Because you can set the prices remotely. You don't have to touch the parking meter to set the prices. You could also give discounts for your own residents. If it's a tourist area, like many of the coastal cities, you could, your own residents, based on where their license plate is registered, can pay a lower price. Miami Beach, it doesn't have that many people living there. They have a lot of tourists. And the tourists don't know that the residents are paying a lower price. And in parking garages, you could give your own residents a discount. Say they can get the first 1 or 2 hours free or a lower price or something like that. So I think giving resident discounts is a good way to buy off political opposition. I don't know that's a good idea for transportation policy, but in order to get to yes, I think to emphasize that it'd be like a hotel tax, paid by foreigners, or a tax on rental cars at the airport. The residents don't pay. It's like Monty Python's idea of solving Britain's economic problem by taxing foreigners living abroad. In most streets, when you look at a car parked at the curb, you don't know where it comes from. It certainly doesn't come from somebody who lives or works on this block. It comes from somebody else. So I think we've all heard the mantra that information wants to be free. But I think parking wants to be paid for in order to allocate it properly. And to allocate it properly, you don't want to have all this cruising for parking. People driving around hunting for parking. There's a survey I did of looking through all kinds of weird, obscure literature of studies that have been done since 1927 in Detroit. It was like, how long does it take to find a car parking space, or what share of the traffic is cruising? It was appropriate to do the first research in Detroit, I suppose, but it's been on 4 continents for about 80 years. And they only look for cruising where they expect to find it, but when they found it, about 1/3 of the cars were cruising for parking. That doesn't mean 1/3 of all cars were cruising for parking. That's a misunderstanding. That's often a misstatement based on this places where cruising is the worst. Here's a study done in Chicago that I like a lot. Some people, they station people at every corner and follow the license plate so they wrote them down as they pass so they could recreate the path of travel. And some people were fixated on a particular block, and others were open to new experiences and things would be better on another block. But I think all of us think that we somehow are disadvantaged because of this. And it leads to desperation. It leads to very dangerous traffic behavior. I've seen people make a U-turn in the middle of the street because they saw space on the other side. I've seen this cause an accident. I did have my cell phone out at the time when I walked around Portland, and I saw very, very dangerous behavior. I was able to interview the driver afterwards, and she told me, she goes, whatever it takes to get a curb parking. Well, getting back to the contact and the relevant benefit, you can't, as Scott said, you just can't tell people it will reduce traffic congestion, it will reduce CO2 emissions, it will make for a better world. You have to show people it's better for them, the stakeholders, the people who are listened to when they say, well, should we have parking meters on this block? Because most people think that the money really disappears into thin air. It really does disappear into thin air. You put it into a little box of thin air, and it seems to have no political support. It goes into the general fund, you might as well give it to the UN and support most people. And it makes transportation planners seem very animated, that they're just trying to make life difficult for you. We're not trying to get people, getting the price of parking right is not trying to get people out of their car. It'll make it easier to be in your car. It's just you won't be driving around aimlessly, not aimlessly, you're hunting for parking. So, here's a picture outside the neighborhood near the Los Angeles Coliseum in the 1984 Olympics, but it happens at every event at the Coliseum, and it happens around a lot of athletic arenas and things like that, is that the residents move their own cars out on the street and they rent their driveways to ticket holders. Sometimes the ticket holders who come regularly, every week or every month or every year. The same people go to the same place. So it's not un-American to charge for parking. I think it's a very American people to charge people for what, very American principle, to charge people for what they use. We didn't become a great nation by being a bunch of freeloaders, but when it comes to parking, that's exactly what we want. We want to be a freeloader, and it doesn't work as public policy. So this idea of parking benefit district and giving money to the pay for added public services worked best in a place called Old Pasadena, the old part of town in Pasadena. It was a wonderful shopping district in the 1920s, but it fell on hard times and the Depression and the World War II. It didn't have much parking off street, so it never thrived after the automobile took over everywhere. And people thought, is this ever going to revive? There were wonderful buildings in terrible conditions. And this is what it looks like now. It's one of the most popular tourist destinations in Southern California. 30,000 people come on the weekend just to walk around in the streets. What had been threatening and dirty is now inviting and friendly. So what happened, a big cause of this was parking meter revenue return. The city wanted to put in parking meters because the few curb spaces were occupied by the store employees and their owners, and they moved them every 2 hours so they could continue getting free parking. City wanted to put in parking meters, and the merchant said, no way, it'll chase away the few customers we have. And they argued for a couple of years until finally the city of Pasadena said, if we put in the parking meters, we'll spend all the public revenue on the public goods you want. And suddenly the property said, that's different. Let's run the meters till midnight. Let's charge a higher price. justice going to reduce air pollution or traffic congestion or anything like that. It's going to be spent right in front of my door. And I'm not in this parking benefit district. I don't get anything. So they get about $1 million a year in a small business district, and it made a huge difference. Here's a quote from they appointed an advisory board as sort of a political nexus to the city council. The advisory board recommends what to do with the money. When we figured out that the money would stay here, that the money would be used to improve the amenities, it was an easy sell. That's what Scott was saying. How do you make it an easy sell? It isn't by buying off opponents. It's by dangling something in front of the stakeholders, saying that if you have parking meters, this is what you will get. And the people who are going to pay for parking, they come from LA or Glendale or someplace else. They don't even know what's happening. And often if they get there, they won't even remember that there weren't parking meters there. So then that meters say that there are small changes to big changes, that the buildings had been neglected for many years, except for urban renewal. You can see a picture on the right-hand side where they'd torn down a lot of wonderful old buildings. Urban planners used to think that was the solution, is urban renewal. We'll use eminent domain and tear down buildings and build new buildings with plenty of off-street parking. Here's another block that people had painted over bricks for decades, and now they carefully took all the paint off, and the city put in new street trees, historic street furniture, and completely replaced all the sidewalks. Here's an empty tire warehouse. It had been empty for more than a decade, and it became a department store with no new parking. Here's a typical alley in Pasadena, with mattresses and dead animals and overhead wires. The meter money was used to put the wires underground, to pave it for pedestrian areas, and now there are outdoor cafes in the alleys, which had been threatened. Nobody would ever go into them. It's such a wonderful place now, but have to pay for parking. But when you get out of your car and put money in the meter, it comes right out the other side. They pressure wash the sidewalks every 2 weeks. They sweep the sidewalks every night. They remove graffiti every night. Not that there is any anymore. If it's removed every night, there's no point putting it up. Another small town in California, Ventura, they put in meters with a parking benefit district, and there was a survey of what the owners thought about it. I think almost all of them said they agreed with this. In a city where previously they had parking meters, and the city council, every member of the city council and the mayor was thrown out of office for putting in parking meters. So the parking meters have been hard to touch until they said, well, if we put in the parking meters, we'll spend all the revenue on this block. And I think they're aiming for a 15% vacancy rate, that's right. And one of the things they did is they hired police cadets to act as ambassadors and to help show people how to use the meters. And the crime rate went down by almost 50% just because these people costumed as police officers were paid for by the parking meter revenue. And they gave free Wi-Fi to everybody in the metered area. So these parking benefit districts, the reason I thought of them initially was to manage transportation. That's what parking meters are for, is to manage transportation. And they reduce, done right, they reduce traffic congestion. They make it safer for pedestrians because there are fewer people distracted looking for a curb space and turning right at every corner. But it's also an economic development tool because they produce money. And you should really be very careful about what you do with the money and what you tell people you're doing with the money and what you show people you're doing with the money. So I think it really can help a business district to thrive if they get the price right. I don't know what happened to this. I think say in 2016, Massachusetts legislature passed it out to allow parking benefit districts. I spoke in Boston, I think it was 3 or 4 years ago, and I chastised my guest, my host, for having the most backward parking prices in the country because they charge $1.25 an hour throughout the city. And they had argued in city council for 8 years whether to raise that price from $1 to $1.25. And I thought it was because they were just incompetent. But it wasn't that. It was the state legislature that had a law saying that you cannot charge more on a parking meter than is enough to repay the cost of the parking meters, of operating them and buying them. That they couldn't produce net revenue. They had to be just cost, to reimburse the cost of the meters. So there was no money from the meters to pay for public services, and the price was too low. So it wasn't the people in Boston who had made a mistake, it was the state legislature who made a mistake. But my host moved heaven and earth, well, I shouldn't say that, but they worked with their legislators to say, well, let's change the law. And that happened in 2016. Just say that you could set prices to manage parking demand, and pay for what at the end of it, and transportation gurus, but not limited to operations of mass transit facilities for biking and walking. You could do anything you want, really, in the metered area. And it really says, I think, I forget what the first three letters were, any town, city or town, that's right, can establish a parking benefit district to spend the meter money in the metered area. So they completely reversed what had been the state law, saying you can't charge more for than it costs to reimburse for installing the meters. And now they say you can charge anything and you can spend the money in the meter district. It took effect on January 1st of this year. And here are just some headlines from a newspaper article in the Boston Globe that on January 3rd they established their first parking meter district. That's just 2 days later. They knew the law was going to come into effect. It isn't that they worked that fast, but they had time to plan for it. And performance pricing is another way of saying demand-based pricing. And you could price it up to $3.75 an hour. And testing this performance pricing and get more parking spots available. In one area, they just jumped the price up to, I think, to $3.75, and the other area, they nudge it up slowly. And in the most recent price change, more prices went down than up. Partly, again, because they had different prices at different times of day, and the morning prices went down. So the third, remember, 3 bullet points, we'll get the price right, spend it in parking benefit district, then you can get rid of these off-street parking requirements. I suppose the Cisco was told, everybody, landlord was told, you can do what you want with your land. It's really nice land. It's a beautiful part of California. If you're a car, it's a great place to be. Well landscaped, nice hillside views and things like that. So I thought you knew Eddie was Photoshop. So I took some buildings from the University of London and I put them on the perimeter. But you know what it's called? A liner building. It's a thin building surrounding the perimeter of a parking lot. So when you walk along the street, it looks like a city. 20 feet behind, it's a parking lot. So it lines it visually and with active uses. And it's, that could be housing, that would be certainly great for people who can just walk across the parking lot to their offices. And you wouldn't have to provide any parking for the housing either. The parking is already there. You don't have to assemble land. It's all under one ownership. It's not brownfield. It's just ready to build as soon as the city gets out of the way. soon as the city stops saying, well, no, you can't do that. You need all that parking for the office building, and you'll need extra parking for the housing. You could dig a gigantic underground parking garage, I suppose, to do it. But you don't need that parking. You have to charge for parking on the street, because you'll have to start charging the commuters for parking in the parking lot, and the residents who live there, they would have to pay for a parking space if they have a car. Or 2 parking spaces if they have 2 cars. It's up to them. We're not governmentalizing the car decision or the parking decision. We're leaving it up to businesses and households. Well, this is California, and I don't think we're going to build something like that. So I just took a building from downtown LA, a very nondescript apartment building, and said, well, that's probably what it would look like. And if it was profitable, and remember, housing prices are so high in California. Just think of how much that housing would be. And it turned out to be more valuable than a empty parking space. You could do some more. And if that turned out to be profitable, the city could begin to look like this at the ground level. That's what it looks like in LA. I think it has an elementary school or some kind of preschool on the ground floor, and a grocery store, and these are apartments above. That's in downtown LA. And this is what it would look like if you spread something like that. It doesn't have to be that. It could be offices. It could be garden departments. It could be single-family houses. It could be anything that property owner wants to build. So I think that there are a lot of good effects that the city says they're trying to do everything they can to achieve it through other ways. They want more jobs. Just think of all the people who would be employed building those buildings, the drywallers and the electricians and the plumbers, and the architects and the planners and the consultants. And it would increase the housing supply right where we want it, job-adjacent housing, where people want to live, if we allow it. And people who live there would cut the commuting time from an hour down to a 3-minute walk. And they would spend less on cars and fuel, much of which we import. And we can't afford apartment buildings, but we can import cars and fuel. And then the traffic congestion is terrible. So people, in order to avoid the traffic congestion, many would probably like to live closer to work. And it would increase the demand for technology, the very high-tech methods of charging for parking that are now available, and maybe even slow climate change. We have to think about that. And I think finally, getting back to Scott going on, saying, well, how do you sell this to people at different ends of the spectrum? People on the left don't like markets in some cases, and people on the right don't want any change. So I think that you could get political support if you say, here's the context, and here's how it would fit with your political needs. It would increase public spending. There would be a lot of money from parking meters to pay for new public services, to pay for daycare for the centers, for the people who live in the buildings. It could pay for the sidewalks. It could pay for free Wi-Fi, all that sort of thing. And conservatives will see this getting the government off their back. That is deregulation. We're taking away what I think is a very bad regulation. And the environmentalists have a lot to gain from this because it should lower our demand on resources. And businesses will be able to open up without being told by the planners, where's your parking? Where's your a parking lot 3 times bigger than your restaurant? And the new urbanists have a lot to get out of this, that the cities will look better, and we can live without at higher density while being overrun by our cars. You can't say that new development will create a shortage of parking, because prices is what will prevent the shortage of parking, as it prevents the shortage of everything else. And I think that libertarians, they're alive and well, that individuals will be the ones making the choices, rather than planners and city councils. And property rights advocates will realize that that they have been imposed upon by the government all these years, and that they have more ability to do what they want with their property. And of course, developers will see that this makes so many more things possible. That they'll often, the amount of parking a developer will provide depends on the site. If you're going to have one underground level of parking, that's X number of cars. That's probably the number of cars you will have, parking spaces you will have. And then residents have a lot to gain because it will pay for improving their neighborhood. And affordable housing advocates will say we can build cheaper, larger units without so much parking. Yes, a neighborhood activist will get something to quarrel about in their neighborhood as to what they want to spend the money on. The biggest beneficiaries, I think, will be local elected officials. So the council meeting won't go on until midnight deciding whether the parking requirement for a nail salon should be 5 or 6 parking spaces per 1,000 square feet, or whether the parking meter should go from 50 cents to 75 cents an hour. Just listening to a city council babble on about parking sort of is just sort of soul numbing. So I think that you can sort of isolate the extremists by saying, well, this probably does appeal to your particular brand of libertarian thinking or socialist thinking. It's almost like market socialism, a term that they don't use much anymore, but the government owns the land and uses the market to set prices, and then the government spends the revenue. That's not privatization. That's socialism. Government ownership of the land and government spending of the revenue. All they use the market for is to set the right price. They don't rely on a city council to set the price. The very inappropriate group to set a price for parking. What do we do with all the cars we won't need? Well, here's a sculpture called long-term parking in France. We could have a number of these. We've got one of these on every block in the United States. Well, what about all these gargantuan parking garages that we built? Here's an adaptive reuse that would be good for many cities, especially with the college population. A planner can do better than by closing with a quote from Jay Chambers. I don't think that we're a great nation because of what we have produced. We've inherited a great nation. And I think we're not doing enough to pass it on to the future. That we're not doing our best to make sure that these cities are better. The Athenian pledge, wasn't that it that Scott Doyle talking about? We're not fulfilling the Athenian pledge. Here's a quote from President Eisenhower in his famous farewell address about the military-industrial complex. But I think that we are plundering for our own ease and convenience the precious resources of them all in a way that President Eisenhower could never have conceived. And then our greatest writer among presidents, Abraham Lincoln, I think our case is new. We have new technology. We have new understanding of how the problems caused by traffic congestion and air pollution. We have new opportunities. It is time to think anew and to act anew. It's probably not very often that a college professor ends a talk to you with a quotation from 2 Republican presidents. But I think that every president, well, maybe except for one, would agree with what the President Eisenhower or President Lincoln said. But I think we'll always have a problem unless here succeeds in this new technology. Well, until then, I think that we'll have to work with what we have. And that's about all I know, so I better stop. Thank you very much for inviting me.
All right, the much anticipated Q&A section with Donald Shoup. Who wants to get us started?
live in Boston, and where my office is, they implemented that new policy and the price went up. And it was already okay for me because I have something called the parking gene. Have you heard this?
What was the question?
So I just wanted to know, it's working great in Boston. I actually think they should increase the price of parking there to more like $9 an hour, because we have private off-street garages that still charge $35 to $45 a day. And if the private market is supplying it at that price and the public is restricting the revenue, that's like the government setting up a monopoly that, you know, we're going to ban the sale of ice cream on the street, and only these ice cream shops can make it. It's really a diversion, you know, to the private market.
Well, I think that aside from Boston's cap of $3.75 an hour, I think they're doing the right thing. It should be waiting until the price goes up. It will get there, but I don't think it will get to $9 an hour. I think that when I did Boston, I made the case that Boston has done a terrible job, because the garage at City Hall, the first hour is $11, and the curb is $1.20. I don't think that means that the curb price will go up to 11. I think the reason the prices are so high for the first hour is because somebody who wants to park for just an hour and is in a hurry, there's nothing else they can do. That they can either drive around endlessly or pay $11. So I think that I would be happy to see that if they just change prices every 2 months. And it could be as in San Francisco, it took a long time before much happened. That if San Francisco go up by 25 cents an hour and nothing happened, another 25 cents and nothing happened, another 20. Once it got up to about another $2 up, then suddenly the spaces appeared. So I would trust the market to say, let's adjust the price until there is 1 or 2 open spaces. Now that they've got to where they should be, they don't change many prices at all, because the goal of this policy is not to get people out of their cars so that half of the parking spaces are empty. I think it'd be better, because the curb parking spaces is a small part of the total parking supply. Even here at Lewiston, there are a number of off-street parking garages. So the off-street parking is just a small share of the total. It's the government's responsibility to get the right price for that little icing of parking that they own. Yes?
Thanks for your talk. I found it as informative and refreshing as your book. And since you've proven to be both ahead of your time, but also an accurate predictor of at least some communities' future policies, I'd be interested, and since we're all planners here and trying to think ahead, I'd be interested in your take on the potential impact of, I guess your last slide was kind of an autonomous vehicle, but what do you think self-driving cars, if their adoption is, as some credible prognosticators say, will be dramatic, and price will drive more and more people to ride in autonomous vehicles, what do you think the impact will be on the landscape and policies around parking, at least in downtown areas?
Well, I've made so many bad predictions in the past that I shouldn't make another one. But I would say that if you want to see automated vehicles arrive and thrive, and if you want to see Uber Pool and Lyft Line do well, then an appropriate policy is to remove off-street parking requirements. That will be, if the higher the price of parking, the more incentive you have to take Uber Pool or Lyft Line, or the more incentive you'll have to take an automated vehicle, because you avoid the price of parking. But I don't think that if like in Freeport, that will be the last city on earth that will see automated cars and Lyft Line and Uber Pool. I mean, foolish mistake. When I went to speak in Freeport, staying afterwards and having dinner, and around 8:30, I said,
I went on Lyft or Uber. There was no Lyft or Uber at all in Freeport. The cars were simply not available. I called a cab company, and they didn't have any cabs there. Fortunately, a waiter drove us back. I thought we'd have to sleep in the restaurant. So I think if you want to see, if you think automated cars are a good idea, then these parking policies that I recommended will help that come along.
Professor, I have a simple logistics question. If I want to take a trip downtown and I want to know where parking is cheaper on one block compared to another, is the idea that I'm going to be consulting my phone or the internet before my trip, or possibly during my trip, or how does that work?
But in San Francisco and Los Angeles, which have kind of gold-plated system, you could go on the web and you can see what the price is on every line. And the thing that what did happen, and one of my other bad predictions, or any economist's prediction, was that I had no idea how different the prices would be from one block to the next. In some parts of town, you can pay 25 cents an hour on one block, and 2 blocks away it would be $4 an hour. I thought that couldn't happen, but it does. It must be because people are unaware of the price differences. And most manufacturers I talk to now say they think that paying for parking is shifting to the dashboard of your car. Cars are now connected, they know where they are. In Germany already, you can press a button when you arrive at the parking space, and you start paying for it. Your car starts paying for parking, and as soon as you move out of the space, you stop paying for parking. But you can also tell the car where you want to go. You can all do that with a navigation system. And you say that I'm willing to walk if I can get a cheaper price. And it'll give you voice directions on turn-by-turn directions of where you should go if you want a low price of parking. On the other hand, if you're going to be there for a very short time and you're in a hurry, the price of parking doesn't mean much. If you're going to stay for 15 minutes, it doesn't make any difference. It's $4 an hour. And then I think that one of the benefits of having different prices at different locations is that people can walk farther in order to save money. And it's better for all of us if we walked more instead of driving around hunting for spaces that are the same price everywhere. And if you're a low-income person, it gives you the opportunity to save on parking if you're willing to walk. And so if you're willing to walk, and if you're willing to look on the web as to where you could get a cheaper price, it would be good. I think the restaurants ought to show, you could print these maps, they ought to have a window showing what the prices are in the neighborhood. So that if you, maybe after you get to the restaurant, you couldn't change it, but your location, but the next time you know that there is, I could pay just 25 cents an hour if I'm willing to walk 5 blocks. Yes?
Just a 2-part question. Part 1, you mentioned London. Do you think that congestion fees for luxury vehicles or SUVs are really a effective modifier for congestion in urban areas and merited? And part 2, related to university satellite campus parking, it seems to be overbuilt. Is it helpful, hurtful, and what's a useful alternative?
Well, yes, I'm a big fan of congestion pricing. It's just that parking pricing is so much easier. It's much easier to charge a parked car than it is a moving car. And you don't have, with congestion pricing, you have to charge a big area. With parking pricing, you can just try it out on one block. You can try it as a pilot program. You can try it at one point in time. And people are used to paying, there are users already who are used to paying for parking, but not used to paying congestion pricing. And the transactions cost with congestion pricing tends to be kind of expensive. The equipment is expensive, and you have to have an awful lot of hardware and technology. And I think with parking, people say that parking meters are going to disappear not long from now, because the cars will be paying for parking. We'll use our cell phones. In some parts of London, you can't pay except with a cell phone. They don't want to have meters on the street. And if you
the store owner will do the transaction for you. That happens in Galveston, for example, but there are no meters. You can only buy a cell phone, and people who don't have a cell phone can do the transaction at the nearby store. Yes?
Hi, thank you again for speaking today. It was enlightening and great as a follow-up to reading everything that you've written in your book. A couple quick questions. One, expanding on the very first question about privatized parking. With a municipality that is looking to have better parking policy and curb parking policy, do you think that privatization of parking lots in that situation is a good move for that municipality or a bad move? And the other question is, does your local buy-in strategy change if there's a greater mix of local people parking and taking up that paid parking as opposed to just non-locals?
Well, I think that in San Francisco, they have a lot of public parking garages, and they use the same pricing system as with SF Park. They bump the prices up or down at different times of day. I think a government at least could set prices just as well as a private operator. In fact, it could be better, because I think private operators usually set prices to generate the most revenue. Whereas I think if you have a municipal parking garage that was built to provide parking for the stores and for customers and for users, to draw people to the area, and you should aim for about an 85% occupancy rate. And to do that, you should adjust prices up or down. In San Francisco, many prices went down on the off-street parking garages. It's just been too high. And nobody had been paying any attention to the fact that some garages were only 20% full during the daytime. So the government can be very careful about what they're doing. But I think you have a principle for setting prices. Say that the city council said, and this is what Seattle does, it's right in the legislation. We want to see 1 or 2 open spaces in every block. And it's up to the parking manager to do that. They don't get permission from anybody to set the prices. So I think it's important when the city council said, we're a city council that sets policy, not prices. Our policy is for there should be the prices should be set to yield 1 or 2 open spaces in every block, and assign that pricing responsibility to the parking manager. Because any city council member could just look out the window and see whether the parking manager is doing a good job. Everybody could say, rather easily, this price is too high because there's just vacant spaces all day long. And the parking manager has now the technical capacity to set the right prices. And I think that there's no reason why it would be better off done by a private manager than a public manager. I hope that answers your question.
And about the big local buy-in, you're saying like with the business owners and stuff, it's one thing to say that you're having the revenue come back to that district, but what if the majority of your people that are coming in parking and needing to pay for parking are not people from away, but people from that municipality that are already paying taxes, etc.?
Well, they're probably not people from the people who are parking on the block are not meter on the block are probably not the people who live there or work there. They're probably customers there. As I said, you can always give a discount for residents of your own city.
Yeah, adding to that, I thought that the resident discount was a really clever way to deal with areas that are more touristy, could be appropriate in a place like Portland. I'm curious about whether there might also be other nuances for other uses, whether that's handicapped parking spots or ride shares. For a short time, I lived right in downtown Portland, didn't have a car, and had the U-Haul car share membership, and there happened to be 2 spots. There's a pickup truck, and so there are 5 spots in the city that are car share cars. But handicapped parking is also an issue. If you have less off-street parking requirements, the way Portland deals with this, it's free, or you can save longer for a handicapped spot. How do you deal with those sorts of nuances with the system?
that car is gone, nobody else can park in that space. So it'll be vacant and the zip car is out driving around. Because the zip car has to have an open space when it comes back. At least that kind of car to go is one that can go drive anywhere and walk anywhere. But I think a number of cities have dedicated curb parking spaces to shared cars, and the shared car company pays the city for what the meter would have earned. And that's, I think, just as good at or even better is to having them dedicated in garage spaces, but everybody can see the zip car. Whenever you walk past it, you see a zip car is available for me. And it's advertising for it, and you can see that it's available. Yes?
So this may be taking the pay parking a step far, but have you seen anybody look at variable pricing in parking decks? I'm thinking of the ground floor being much more premium space than the rooftop exposed, SL Park or otherwise. Trying to stratify within that to price premium.
I'm a big fan of top deck discounts. A number of garages do that. The top deck is the most unpopular place to park because you have to drive all the way up and it bakes in the sun and it gets rained on and things like that. So I think it's a good idea to have a top deck discount. And in those structures, you see the top deck is often full. And I was once in Raleigh. It was a 9-level parking structure, and they told me about their top deck discount. So I went up to the top deck. You get a great view of the city. And it was almost full. And then the next 4 levels were empty. So I think it probably should say, as you talk, it should be not just 2 prices, but you should say that some people are, that they want to have covered parking, but they're willing to drive up to the 8th level for that, so that 8th level should have a discount as well. Yeah? Yes?
Thank you very much for your time. Can you discuss what's happening in California regarding the increase in electric vehicles and then charging stations? Should that be privatized? Should it be public? Both? Maybe just a little insight. Give me an idea.
Well, I'm a fan of solar panels in parking lots, solar canopies they call them. A number of universities have them, so it provides shade for the parked cars. I mistakenly thought it would be a big deal if the solar panels would put out direct current, and the cars use direct current. I thought it could bypass converting the direct current to alternating current, and then alternating current back to direct current for the car. Apparently that doesn't really work. But I think that solar panels, I thought that cities, if they have parking requirements, even if they don't have parking requirements, they say if you're going to have surface parking at your location, you ought to, we're going to require you to have some of them covered with solar panels. They look like high-tech trellises. They're quite decorative in many cases. I was at one in San Diego, and they had solar umbrellas, I think they called it. It was a central pier, it went up, and the top of it rotated to follow the sun. It was very high-tech, very expensive.